In 1887, Lord Acton wrote a letter to Bishop Mandel, a Catholic bishop, in which he urged the bishop to ensure that the moral code that everybody was held against must apply to the leaders in the same manner. It is in this letter where you find the now famous adage which says power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It comes from that letter between Lord Acton and Bishop Mandel in the year 1887. In 1945, George Orwell wrote his novel, which is titled Animal Farm. The book is a satire of a farm owned by a Mr. Jones, who was eventually overthrown by his own animals on the farm on account of his oppression and injustices against the animals. This revolution was led by the pigs. What is interesting in this satire is that after the pigs have taken over from Mr. Jones, they fall prey to exactly the same corruption of power that led to them ousting Mr. Jones from the farm. In this episode, I highlight certain events and cases in history about corruption to see if there could be lessons for contemporary leaders in respect of these lessons. Transparency International defines corruption as the abuse of power for private gains. The definition seems to create a direct link between power and corruption. And therefore, a number of questions arise. Is corruption the product of power? Is corruption influenced or informed by power? Does corruption symbolize power? In 1993, I was in a group that traveled to the United States on a visitor's program. The visit took us as far as the Congress building, and during that tour of the Congress building, two things struck me. The first one was when I learned from our tour guide that the Library of Congress in the United States has a collection of about 60 million hard copy books. I was amazed. But something else caught my curiosity. We were taken to a part of the Congress building where there were statues of former congressmen who had served the United States with all their patriotism. But one statue stood out, and this was a statue of one of the most corrupt congressmen in the history of the United States. I was amazed to learn that a powerful country like the United States, with all its established systems, has had, and probably even today has, corrupt leaders in its society. But it was also interesting to learn how Americans are able to share even the dark part of their history. The Lockheed Corporation was an American company that manufactured aeroplanes in the 1970s. The company had started facing financial problems, liquidity problems in the sale of its products. In 1976, the Congress Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs received a report that Lockheed Corporation was involved in acts of bribery across the world. One of the men at the center of bribery by the Lockheed Corporation was none other than the then Prime Minister of Japan, and his name was Kakoi Tanaka. In December 1976, Kakoi Tanaka was arrested and charged with corruption. His trial would run for 7 years until 1983, when he was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He appealed the sentence and the conviction to the Supreme Court and was on bail pending appeal. The case was not heard, and Tanaka died in 1993. The result of the Lockheed scandal and the Kakoi Tanaka led the United States to enact what is known as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And this act now governs all U.S. companies across the world. The commodity trading company, Glencore International, was in May of 2022 convicted under this act. And Glencore had to pay a sum of $700 million US after sentence. Glencore was also made to pay a sum of about 340 million pounds in the UK, where it was again sentenced for bribery. The US case found that Glencore had been going around the world, engaging itself in corruption, getting preferential contracts in Nigeria, Cameroon, DRC, and many other countries across the world. There was a lesson there for all American companies. In May 1989, the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was on a state visit to China. During that same month, there was simmering tension in China. The students had risen against the government. Their grievances: nepotism and corruption in government. On the 4th of June, while the students were gathered in the Tiananmen Square, army tanks rode in to bring to an end that demonstration and quell the protests. Several students died in that episode. The Chinese have some of the most comprehensive anti-corruption provisions in the world today. For example, it is an offense in China for a public official to offer a bribe to a public officer in order to gain some illegitimate benefit. It is also an offense for a public official to offer a bribe to a relative of a public officer. And such acts would earn you a prison sentence of up to 10 years, or life imprisonment, or a death penalty. So you can actually be executed in China for corruption. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines was the president until 1986, when he was ousted out of power through a people power demonstration. Marcos went into exile. The US Congress Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs heard through a report that the Marcoses had an amount of $10 billion US in unexplained property. They didn't say proceeds of crime. They simply said the $10 billion US by the Marcoses is unexplained wealth on their part. In Kenya, in July of this year, 2025, there were protests by what is called the Gen Z generation. The youths were protesting against the government's ban on certain social media platforms. But also collateral to that was the grievances by the youths that there was systemic corruption amongst government officials in Kenya. What is even more interesting was that they didn't limit the allegations of corruption against government officials only. They were also aggrieved that family members of government officials were displaying wealth which they could not explain. And those protests shook Ruto's government, and it was at one point believed that his stay in office was just a matter of days. But he survived the tempest. The next interesting part, after all these incidents, is a research which has been undertaken by a researcher by the name of Thomas Isbell. Thomas Isbell has conducted research in 2024-2025 of 36 African countries to establish the rate of corruption in these countries. His research is very interesting. The first 3 top most corrupt countries in Africa are South Africa at 83%, Ghana at 76%, Nigeria at 75%. The least corrupt are as follows: Egypt at 28%, Burkina Faso at 28%, and Morocco at 26%. Zambia stands in the middle at 56% in that corruption rating index. What Thomas Isbell's research also established is who is corrupt. It was to answer that question. And the research revealed that the police and government officials are the most corrupt in these countries which were the subject of the research. The police being the first and government officials being the second. In 2001, President Mwanawasa took over from Frederick Chiluba. Mwanawasa's crusade was the fight against corruption, and he set up what was known as the Task Force Against Corruption during that time. The task force was led by one of the eminent Zambians, the former special assistant to Kenneth Kaunda by the name of Mark Chona. Chiluba and his associates were arrested and prosecuted for corruption. But Levy's crusade did not last long. It was short-lived because he died in August of 2008. He was succeeded by Rupia Banda. During Arabi's reign in power, the corruption index in Zambia started going up. In 2011, Arabi would be defeated by Michael Sata of the Patriotic Front. Sata had been promising the Zambian people during the campaigns in the run-up to the 2011 elections that he was going to fight the corruption that people were seeing in the Rupia Banda government. When Sata took over, his attitude and approach to corruption was something that was lukewarm. He died in October of 2014 without achieving much. Come Edgar Chagwa Lungu, who succeeded Sata in 2014. The ECAO government was one under which Zambians saw uncontrollable acts of corruption within the ruling party and in government. When HH took over after his landslide victory against Edgar Chagwa Lungu in 2021, he also embarked on the fight against corruption. Now, the Anti-Corruption Act, which is in place today, was preceded in 1980 by the Corrupt Practices Act. The Corrupt Practices Act, which was enacted in 1980, was so done under the UNIP government. It was not the initiative of UNIP per se, because the act, including the infrastructure which established the Anti-Corruption Commission, were financed by the British government under the Department for Finance and International Development, also known as DFID. But the act was not active. That law was not active until Levy gave it a bit of life. And we now see under Hakainde Hichilema more life, more activity, and more seriousness in the fight against corruption. The success story is evidenced by a few former ministers in the PF government and senior government officials against which the prosecution has secured some convictions. Some of them are serving jail terms today. But HH has his critics too. They allege, and maybe rightly so, that his fight against corruption is selective, that there is a surge in corruption in the UPND government itself, which is not being addressed. That those that are involved in corruption in the UPND government are treated as sacred cows. But that does not take away a bit of the success story. How then does Africa get to combat corruption? One of the problems facing African countries in combating corruption are weak systems. The institutions in Africa are weak. We are still running politics of the old man. The corruption watchdogs themselves are invariably vulnerable to political pressure and political intimidation. Those that are appointed want to secure their jobs. But if there is anything to learn that we learn from the Lockheed and Glencore cases, is this: that those that are corrupt in Africa are not alone in that scheme. They are in collaboration with these international multinational corporations. Another side of what Tom Burgess may call the looting machine. They sponsor African politicians to win elections. They continue to control them while in office. The leaders do not feel accountable to the people. African leaders still believe, and religiously so, that politics is about accumulation of wealth and not service. And this is the case of Africa. One would hope that it is time that Africa started giving birth to leaders that are independent-minded, that are not puppets of these international corporations, that are patriotic, nationalistic, and leaders that believe in politics as a service to the people. My quote for today: the corrupt are not wicked because of what they take from the poor, but because of the greed that they show against them. The corrupt are not wicked because of what they take from the poor, but because of the greed that they show against them. Thank you.